Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Susan McKenzie. I'm the CEO of the Emergency Services Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar this afternoon. We run a number of webinars each year, and the whole idea is that we provide access to our members and their broader community around with experts that they may not normally have access to. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy this session today. And I'm in Melbourne, and I'll begin by saying that I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I am, and that's that the traditional owners and custodians of the Kulin Nation. And in Melbourne, that includes a number of people. I'm looking at my side screen because I'm not at home, and so I'm in a different place and I want to get it right. So that includes the Wurundjeri, the Boonwurrung, the Wadawurrung, the Tanggurrung, and the Dja Dja Wurrung people, so who are here in Melbourne. So I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise the continuation of their culture, which of course has a great aspect of that is their learning and sharing of stories, and that's what we're doing today. So on behalf of us all, I extend that acknowledgement of country, knowing that we've got people here from right across our great land. And most importantly, I would like to welcome Professor Monique Crane. And Monique is in New South Wales, and Monique is the Professor of Organisational Psychology at Macquarie University, and she's a leading expert in occupational health, resilience and recovery. So what better person to speak to us about how to create workplaces where people don't just survive, they thrive. And I think we're onto something here, Monique, because so many people have been interested in this topic. So I'm going to pass over to you now. And if anybody's got any questions, please put them in the chat. It's going to be, and I'll moderate the questions from there because we've just got such a number of people online, it will be hard to actually go to you. So if you've got a question, put it in the chat and I'll be sure to make sure Monique gets that question. So over to you, Monique. You're on mute, Monique.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And so I am here, in New South Wales. I'm at Macquarie University and I lead a team that specialises in resilience. So we're going to talk about that today. The information I'll present to you today is something we've actually been developing over the last 12 months. And this is the second time I've presented this model to industry. So I really welcome your questions and comments, things that you're not quite sure of how they apply to your setting, because we are interested in feedback about the model so we can make it more applicable to organisations that you might be in. Okay, let's get started. So as I mentioned, we're primarily interested in occupational resilience, but we also work towards understanding how humans develop resilience over the life course. So we know a lot about what kinds of strategies and resources facilitate people's resilience as they learn and grow, but we have very little understanding of how people come to those resources that they have and what accounts for the individual differences in terms of capacities for resilience. So why people have lots of capability and why some people have very few capabilities. And in part, that's determined by the environment, but also by individual level differences and processes that are inherent within each person. We've worked largely with the military for 14 years, including Army and Navy, and we've contributed to their resilience training programs. And we have also contributed to this theoretical space, as I said before, around how resilience actually develops over the life course. And the good news is that resilience is a a very common outcome for people, which means that the processes that underlie resilience and its development are most likely normal, and they're the sort of not normal state of having a mental health issue. We know that when people encounter a mass trauma event like 9/11, or they get an event on deployment where they have encountered some sort of a traumatic experience, 80% of people actually demonstrate resilience over those events. So what we know is that is actually a normal process that underlies resilient development. So that's really good news. It's just understanding what that actually is. Okay, so I'm going to refer to a few terms today that I want to get a shared understanding of and make sure that we all understand in the same way. So the first is that there are many, we say multifaceted, many different job characteristics and individual differences that explain resilience. Now, when I say resilience, I mean resilience as an outcome, and I'll talk to you about what that means in a second. And the second part that I'm going to talk about and refer to is capacities for resilience. And that's how we think about thriving. Hello?
Yeah, all good.
You still there?
Yes,
okay.
all good.
That's fine. My computer just completely went blank for a second.
Scary.
So that was worrying. Okay, no, so you're still there. Good.
Yes.
So capacities for resilience, and that's what we think about as being thriving. So let's have a look at what these definitions specifically mean. So when we talk about resilience in kind of the research terms, we mean the maintenance and quick recovery of mental health during and after exposure to significant life stresses, and that can include stress as you experience it in your daily life, adversity and traumatic events. And resilience looks like two different things. It can look like bouncing back resilience, which is, where we experience a mild decline in our functioning, maybe a few sleepless nights. I'm sure we've all experienced that. But at the same time, we also could experience what's called robust resilience. And robust resilience is where we experience a kind of stressor, but we don't have a decline in our functioning. So they're the two different forms of resilience. And the way we normally measure this in practice is by measuring people's mental health outcomes during and after exposure to some sort of event. So, for example, in the military context, the most common one is looking at how people fare after a deployment. But lots of other research has also looked at things like grief and loss, like when they experience the loss of a partner or a child, or other types of adversities like divorce, financial difficulty. Okay, so when I talk about capacities for resilience, I'm talking about something a little bit different. These are the modifiable ingredients or assets that people have that support their resilience. So we're interested in how these develop over time, not just how they achieve resilience. So the types of capacities that we're often talking about are things like resilient beliefs. So having a good understanding, positive understanding of your control over your circumstances, the world, understanding that the likelihood is that you'll have a positive outcome, or that you can minimize or manage your stresses. Now, when we talk about that in psychological terms, it's often referred to as hope, optimism, or coping self-efficacy. And I'm sure they're kind of terms that you probably will have heard in the past. The flexible use of coping strategies is this idea that you have a repertoire of strategies that you can apply to circumstances in ways that are fit for a scenario. So, for example, if you have a stressor in which you have limited control over, that might mean that you need to adjust your strategy that allows you to accept the circumstance, or problem solve in a different way because you don't have direct control over that situation. So, for example, having an illness is a useful one. You can't directly control necessarily being ill, but you might be able to control bits around that. So how fast you recover, or your ability to not get ill in the first place. So there are other aspects that you might be able to control, not the stressor in and of itself. So it's good to have a flexible repertoire to allow you lots of options to cope better in those circumstances. And then the last one that we can also adapt and modify over time is coping resources. And these are the social, motivational, and practical resources that enable coping. So it's really difficult to seek support from supportive people if you don't have any friends. So that often happens and can change over the life course. So, for example, people who move to a different state or even move overseas might find themselves in a situation where they can't access the typical supports that they've had back home or where they were from. And so their coping resources become what we call constrained or limited. And so we need all of these three things to actually be present in reasonable quantities and also develop over time. So when we're younger, we might have limited amounts of these things, and then hopefully as we become adults and encounter adult-like stresses, we develop a greater breadth of each of these buckets of capabilities. So that's another important feature of this, is that these are modifiable. So they're not things that, you know, historically we started thinking about resilience as almost like a trait, like you were born with it, it was somehow genetic. There are genetic parts to the experience of mental health, but these capacities are not fixed by genetics. They are things that people can actually evolve and learn as they grow across the life course. And why this is important to today's discussion, you'll find out in a minute, because part of the process of thriving is also not only just being resilient moment to moment and coping moment to moment, but also growing these capacities into our adulthood as adults and continuing to grow them from the cradle to the grave. And so basically, we're going to talk a little bit about a process that enables that and how that applies to the workplace. So I want to introduce you to this model here, which is a stressor life cycle framework for resilience in organisation. So today I'm going to focus on this framework that we've recently developed, and we're calling this framework the 5 R's model of resilience, just to keep it brief. And so you can see here that there are several R's in this process, the first of which is responding. And responding is where we manage the moment-to-moment stressor experience. Okay, we try to reduce the impact of a stressor. We try to hopefully, you know, get rid of it, problem solve, so that we can return back to what we homeostasis, or a more desirable state of well-being. And this is where typically resilience training is focused. So if you've ever had kind of well-being programs or resilience training, that's typically where the process of training begins and ends. So it's really just focused on people responding momentarily to that particular stress or stresses that might arise in the future, and just managing those. But if you want to make sure that people continue to grow capability into the future and thrive, then you need a different approach for actually making sure people continue to develop. And that means that there needs to be individual and organisational investment in different parts of a process. And I'm going to talk through each of those parts today. And that's where these 5 R's model of occupational resilience comes in. We wanted to help organisations think about, like in broad terms, a set of opportunities for supporting the development of capability, where we're not dictating what organisations should do specifically, but we're saying you need to think about each of these components and provide something in each of these elements that's applicable to your organisations, acceptable to your people and your culture, and relevant to your context, because all organisations are different. Okay, so let's go through each of these elements. So the first one here is about responding. So that's taking the immediate action to attempt to manage the impacts of a stressor, as we've spoken about. And so it's really, as I said before, that's where training might sit. So, for example, if you develop mindfulness strategies in your people or other kind of coping style strategies, that will help them to manage their experience of stress in that moment. And so it's a great strategy. There's lots of evidence for things like mindfulness, but we're just saying the process shouldn't stop there. So the next phase of this process is recovery. And that might be physical recovery or physiological recovery or psychological recovery. And organisations need to also be able to support effective recovery, and have systems in place for that, but staff and employees also need to know how to use recovery time effectively. And so let's talk about what's effective in a moment. But first of all, I just want to illuminate why recovery is so important. So recovery allows us to restore some of the resources lost when we are managing the stressor event in the moment. So we might lose energy, we might become fatigued, and that loss, if there is no recovery process, can only accumulate with time and compound exhaustion, and that creates things that we are probably very familiar with, like burnout, depression, which happens commonly among organisations where there is limited opportunity for recovery, or the recovery opportunity is blocked, or there are barriers to recovery in some way. Now, how to recover well? We need to also make sure, as I said before, that their recovery is done effectively by employees, and that might mean some level of training in individual employees. Recovery is more than just having time off. It's about using time effectively, even for daily recovery. So what the recovery literature has shown us is that when you go on a holiday, and we can just put some ideas in the chat box here, how long do you think that it will take you on return from your leave to come back to the levels of stress and strain that you were before you left? Can people put in some suggestions about how long that might take?
Depends on your inbox, doesn't it, Monique?
Depends on your inbox. Yeah, it might depend on the work. What about, let's say, the average Australian? What do you think the average Australian would report? 2 hours. Okay, yeah, 2 hours. Any other suggestions? 1 week, 8 hours. Okay. The average Australian returns to their levels of strain about 3 weeks after coming back from holiday. So you guys are actually not doing so well compared to the average Australian if it's 4 hours. But generally what that means is that you can't take holidays all the time, right? So you have to have a way of recovering more frequently. The good news is it's not about time. It's not about the amount of time off. It's about how you use that time. And so there's brilliant work by a German scientist called Sabine Sonntag, who has spoken about 4 characteristics of good recovery. And these are psychological detachment from work, a sense of mastery where we're feeling effective, like we're doing an activity, then we feel a sense of mastery in that activity as part of our recovery. The creation of a sense of social engagement or belonging. And finally, the recovery should be enjoyable and promote positive affectivity. Now, you don't have to cover all of those 4 things, but the more you can do, the better. Now, where organisations can come into this is, do they allow you the opportunity for psychological detachment? So, for example, if your workplace is emailing you at 2 a.m. or in the evening time and you're checking emails on your phone, then there's not an opportunity for psychological detachment. And so what that means is that the organisational system and the way the organisation behaves is actually creating a barrier to effective recovery. So we need to think about the interaction between those systems and our workplace behaviours, as well as what the individual themselves knows about creating the conditions for effective recovery. Okay. What's next? So this is going to sound a little bit strange perhaps, but the next process is actually reflection. And this is a process of systematically examining your experiences of stress and coping and considering what happened, how your responses were effective, and what you could do differently the next time, what actions and strategies you could take to improve your stress and coping. Now, reflecting is really important because without reflection, we can only maintain our current levels of those capacities I talked about earlier for resilience. You can only maintain what you currently have if you don't attempt to learn and enhance your strategies into the future. And so I'll give you an example of what this might look like. I was saying earlier that my son is unwell today, so he's here at home with me. And the other day, he, applied to be a school captain, okay? So for the next year. And as part of the process at his school, they need to do a speech in front of the entire school about why they would make a good school captain and things like that. And so what happened was he was extremely nervous when he did his speech. So he came home and he said to me, "It was terrible. I made a terrible speech. No one will vote for me. I almost wet my pants." I'm glad he didn't. And I was shaking and I forgot some of my words. And so he had this his recollection of that experience was that it was a very negative experience. So, initially he sort of responded to that stressor. So he said he tried to breathe and control his breathing. He said, but it didn't work. And he was still very nervous. So he's tried to respond. His dad and I, we spoke to him about it. We calmed him down. And then we gave him a few days to recover. We just said, look, just relax, put it out of your mind. Don't worry too much about it. I'm sure that it was, you envisage it as being worse than it is. But then today, while he's been home with me, I said, I want you to do a little exercise. I want you to reflect on what happened, how you felt, how you thought, what you did, and what you wanted to achieve. And I want you to tell me how you coped with the demands. And I want you to reflect on what you could learn from this experience. And I want you to think about what you did that worked for you and what you did that didn't work for you, and what you might do differently in the future. And I got him to write out under each of those points a little story about how he might cope more effectively. Now, I imagine that for many people, you would let days pass and the child would feel better and recover and not really talk about it anymore. But I think there is a real opportunity and teaching moment in those circumstances, both for young people like my son, who's only 10, but also for us as adults to think and learn about, well, how can I build that capability up as I learn and grow and encounter new stresses that I've not encountered before. And so reflecting systematically is part of that process. And teaching people how to do that well is part of the work that we do in my team and my centre here at Macquarie University. The next part of the framework is refining. So once you have your reflections in hand and you understand the limitations of your process, then the next thing you need to do is actually act on it. We need to change our assumptions about how the world works and how we cope. We need to adopt new strategies or new behaviours as they pertain to coping. So I'm mainly in my area of expertise is in emerging adults. Now that's the 18 to 25-year-olds typically, and I'm really interested in this group because they're going through a lot of change, not just now but also in the past, where they're encountering novel demands for them that look like the foundational adult-like demands they're going to experience in the future. So for the first time, they're entering professional occupational roles, and they're developing romantic relationships, and they're starting to emerge with strategies that help them adjust to these novel things that they wouldn't have experienced necessarily in adolescence. And so in this group, we're trying to help them to refine and make deliberate changes to the way they encounter these new stresses so that they might adapt in the future. So let me just take you through an example for one of my emerging adults. So let's say that this emerging adult is in her first romantic relationship and she's had an argument with her partner. Now, this is a real example from people that we've interviewed. Now, social media, which is bane of their existence, might provide her with a very idealised perspective of romantic relationships. And initially, she might believe or assume this is how real relationships work, and that conflict within those relationships is a sign of incompatibility or of failure in that relationship. So when she has an argument with her romantic partner, these are the kind of ideas or assumptions that she's initially met with. However, if she reflects, she might come to realise that this is an idealised portrayal of that conflict. And you'll be surprised that emerging adults perhaps often do come to this idea and this realisation that what's portrayed on social media and in film is idealised, and that conflict is actually a normal part of being in a relationship and creating boundaries and learning to negotiate in a respectful way. And this shift in her beliefs and her understandings of the world mean that she can make changes also in the way that she confronts conflict. So rather than avoiding conflict in romantic relationships or dumping the fellow, she might engage in problem solving, listening, and respectful dialogue. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is the importance of the exposure to stresses as a catalyst for meaningful reflection that then allows this refinement to our beliefs and strategies in a way that makes us ultimately more adaptive and therefore thrive in the future when we're encountering these and similar stresses again. Now, we might not always adapt or change in the best way possible, but the important thing is that we continue to go through these cycles of experience, reflection and refinement that allows us to cultivate good strategies across the life course. So hopefully that makes sense, because these are fairly complex concepts, and I welcome any questions at the end if you want me to clarify things. Now, the next stage is resource. So finally, we get into this process of resourcing. So people might need the right tools that enable them to change their coping or cope well. They might need different perspectives, say from an employee mental health support service or effective leadership or psychosocial safety. There are always resources that we can put in place, and that can happen at the organisational or at the individual level. So as an individual, if you lack social support outside your organisation, if you lack motivation about the type of work that you do or practical resources, then you might need to be also responsive to resourcing yourself well and cultivating and investing in the necessary resources. Okay, so as I mentioned before, this is not just about training individual employees in these aspects, it's also about supporting them at the individual team and organisational levels. And we're not dictating how organisations approach this, but that they might have different ways of ticking each of these 5 boxes within their context to make sure that it's suitable for the types of demands that they face. And so, yeah, I've talked about those types of things. And so organisations will be vastly different in the way that they achieve this. And this is even amongst organisations within the same sector. So in the military context, Navy looks very different from Army and Air Force because of the way that their jobs are structured differently and the different style and culture of their employees. Okay, so let's take a case example of each of these things. So when we think about, say, responding, how might that look at different levels? So at the leadership level, it might be leaders who are able to provide support to their employees. That's just social support, someone to listen in the context of responding immediately to a stressor event. There might be other support structures in place, such as EAP, that allows people to access and get support. There might be systems that are responsive to strain, such as reducing demands or conflicts, but also personnel with the right training. So, as we said before, reducing things like ruminative thought or high arousal levels, so mindfulness or grounding or other types of strategies, the kinds of strategies my son used when he got up there to do his public speaking. That's the kind of strategies that personnel might learn. Okay, when it comes to recovery, as we spoke about before, we might need structures to permit effective recovery from demands. So, for example, in the Navy, it's a shift working scenario. So some people are going to sleep and other people are waking up. And so that means that people are sleeping through the day, they're sleeping and having meal times at different times. But what we discovered is that there were very simple structures in place that meant the people were not able to get effective recovery and sleep. And one thing was that at 5 a.m. every morning, irrespective of how when people went to sleep, that there would be morning announcements and a bell that would go off, basically waking everybody up. And that might be people who have just gone to sleep. And so reducing those structural disturbances to recovery was something that they needed to implement. Leader awareness of modelling recovery practice. So what this means is that, and one of the work of my PhD students, where she is teaching leaders that they need to actually model good recovery and communicate its value to their employees. And that means that as a leader, you're not just telling employees they need to recover, you are demonstrating it through your actions and behaviours and communicating its value in terms of ongoing promotion of performance and mental health. And so leaders become fantastic role models for recovery practices. And of course, as we talked about before, having personnel that are trained in effective fatigue management and how to recover well when they have the time to do so. Okay, so reflection, systems in place that allow reflection on psychological demands. Sometimes leaders do this with their teams and they're equipped to actually facilitate the types of stressor reflections that I've been talking about in teams, or equipping individuals to do this themselves, which is part of the work that we do here at Macquarie University. Refinement, so making sure that systems within your organisation are able to make refinements or adjust where adjustment is seen as necessary as a consequence of that reflective process. So if you reflect as a team and you decide that your team needs more autonomy in order to manage its demands well, that the system can respond by allowing greater team-based autonomy at that level. Without that, then you become stuck And basically you just have the ongoing demands that you have difficulty managing because you can't implement the types of things without the autonomy to manage those demands well. And so that's where systems can help to refine the strategies that teams or individuals might implement. And then finally, resources. So at all levels, we can increase the level of resources when it comes to things like job design. We can permit personnel to get more feedback about performance so that they can understand and improve, which is a practical resource for people. Personnel can be encouraged to define the meaning of their work and its purpose, which is a motivational resource. We know from work that my prior PhD student did, people who are more autonomously motivated tolerate stress a lot better. So when you're really engaged in what you do, when you see its purpose, when you love what you do and you just find it inherently enjoyable, all work comes with demands, but the demands are managed much better for employees that feel that real sense of purpose and motivation. And of course, leaders trained to reinforce effective support and inclusion in the teams that they lead and the organisations that they lead. So these are just some examples of how organisations can enhance these structures at various levels. All right, so I wanted to give you guys a go at thinking through some of these things in terms of how your organisations currently do or could respond to each of these 5 aspects. So I think what we're going to do is just put some of your responses in the chat. And the first question I had for you was, how does your organisation currently support effective responses for managing stresses? And what could be done at all different levels, at the individual level, the organisation and the team level? So please feel free to just give your suggestions. I think we can all get the benefit of the ideas that you might have. So for example, my organisation has an employee assistance program. They try to manage workload through workload models that make sure that the demands are spread evenly. That's a structural type of response to the demand that tertiary education is under. So they're just some examples.
So I know that there's lots of things that go on in our sector straight after. So would somebody feel more comfortable speaking than typing? And I'll try and identify you if you put your hand up. Oh, people are very quiet. Quiet today. Do you want to unmute, Martine? Somebody's got, Jenny Forsyth's got her hand up. So let's
I'll help you out, Susan.
Yep.
I think in Vic, I think
You
in
always
Vic Poll,
do.
yeah, I think in Vic Poll we're starting to look a lot more about, is that our responsibility as an organisation? Should we be taking that task on, or does that sit with someone else either outside of our organisation, or do we need to put a spotlight on it to highlight that work is coming our way that we shouldn't be responding to?
Right. So yeah, that's a great example. So actually, that's a structural process that the organisation is doing that allows us to choose the stresses that we actually have in our environment. So that's a great example. All right. Well, what about recovery? Is there anything that your organisation does to support effective recovery? Does it teach employees how to recover well? Like maybe there's training. Does it have an electronic sundown, which means that organisations aren't allowed to contact their employees after hours? Yep, the right to disconnect. Great. There's currently legislation around that at the moment where you can, choose not to, that your employer should not be contacting you outside of work hours. Yep, welfare breaks, great, and leave. Yeah, right. Yeah, Macquarie University's been really good organising those kind of leaves and breaks, and it's been really effective for us. Are there any others?
And encouraging leave. I mean, over COVID, people's leave accumulated, didn't it? Because there was nowhere to go, so people didn't take leave necessarily. So it's actually encouraging people to take leave, I think is so important.
Yes, and reducing the barriers to leave. I think that's the other issue. I'm constantly told to take leave, but structurally, the way the work's organised, there is no break in the work. And so it's sort of like, well, how can I take leave without coming back to a nightmare, right? So we need structural facilitators of leave that allows people to go on leave without being worried about what they're coming back to.
Yeah.
Mindfulness sessions are great. I think emergency services, this is an area for improvement. Okay, yeah. Shift work and 24/7 nature of the environment is always a real challenge for disconnecting and disengaging from work, which we talked about as one of those really key areas for recovery.
It's the other thing is, of course, with shift work is the issue of sleep itself and being and the change to your system and how that affects your recovery.
Yes, absolutely. There's some really good research, and I'm not quite across it, but how different forms of shift arrangements and shift orientations can affect sleep and recovery processes. And that's an interesting area, but one I'm not an expert in. Okay, what about organisations that support reflection and learning? So I think somebody mentioned previously about debriefs. So debriefing can be useful. It's got a bad reputation because of trauma debriefs, which can be a problem. And what we've been encouraging is not debriefing after traumatic exposures, but actually reflection after daily microstresses instead. And so that's been an area where we've been focusing on, because the stress levels of microstresses is much lower than traumatic events. Okay, so are there any other systems that allow or encourage effective reflection in organisations, and where organisations can learn from the imposed demands and how they handled it, maybe as a team, as an organisation?
It's interesting too, because what we're talking about here is psychological safety, and it's about, as a team, reflecting if things didn't go well and feeling comfortable to talk about those things as well.
Yes, absolutely. And so psychological safety is a core part of this, because if you don't feel that you can, talk in a team about some of these things, then individual-based reflective practices are probably better. And this is the case in, say, competitive environments. So sometimes in military training, it's a competitive environment. Team-based reflections is not something we think is appropriate. Whereas in environments where you have a good network of support, people do feel a sense of safety, then these practices can work really, really effectively. And what we've seen them do is actually encourage more support and what we call improved interpersonal affect regulation. And what that is where other team members will just try to cheer up other people in the team who might have been having a rough time. Whereas if we keep it to ourselves, that can't happen because people may not be aware of what's going on. And so in teams, we've seen, in military teams, we've seen, if someone's having a rough time, that someone else will make them a hot lunch, or, that they'll come and ask them how they're going and, try to support them. So yes, but you've got to pick your place. Yeah. Okay, so refinement. What about the structures that, or individual activities, team-based activities that can support the refinement of processes? So once we've identified that we might have skill gaps, if I identify that I'm really not good at dealing with situations that I can't control, or I'm really not good at recovery, what are the processes in place or the things I can access that help me to develop new capabilities? Because sometimes when people reflect and we ask them, well, what else could you do? They'll just say, I don't actually know. And so what are the processes in place that help people to refine? Are there any things that are doing that in your workplace?
I'd have to say it's not something I'm aware of, Monique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My best guess would be if you have a psychologist like EAP or counselling services where you can access, you can go and ask questions. You can say, look, I've noticed I'm really having trouble coping with particular types of things. You come armed with that information, and
Or
they can
people
help
who
you.
have a coach, maybe.
Who have what, sorry?
A coach.
A coach, yeah. If the organisation provides coaches, you know, like a leader might say, well, I actually don't know how to lead through this change. Can you help me lead through this? And so having coaches available to upskill is actually part of that refinement process. And we can all benefit from that.
I saw that Shane had his hand up. Do you want to unmute Shane and ask your question?
Yeah, I was just going to say from our perspective, you know, it's big on workplace culture and having that structure around the people that you identify as leaders in your workplace and even your peers, you know, people that you can talk to post an incident that you can confide in. I've certainly got them, and other people in the room have probably got them as well, where, you know, you can essentially identify your shortfalls and speak freely, you know, free of criticism, so you can develop for further interaction should a certain situation pop up again.
Yeah, and get that advice that you need, right? Like, so it's really great that you feel like there are those places you can go, people you can talk to that are going to ultimately help you perhaps see things in a different way. Because if you had all the answers, or if we all had all the answers, then we would just do this amazingly and we wouldn't need to develop anything. But we'll always have gaps. I mean, even as a psychologist, like, we'll always have gaps in the way we cope with demands. We talk about demands as having different characteristics, like why they make us stressed. And one that you probably commonly appreciate, and I've spoken about, is a lack of control. And this lack of control is really difficult for us as humans to deal with because we're natural problem solvers. And so when we encounter a problem that we can't control, we're often really stuck and we don't know what to do with those types of situations. But stresses also have different characteristics, like they can threaten us. They can threaten our safety. They can threaten our sense of status, and how we, you know, look outwardly towards our peers. Stresses can create pain, and that could be emotional pain. And so we don't necessarily know naturally, or haven't developed the capacity to deal with all of these different reasons why stresses are difficult for us. And another very common one is uncertainty. I don't know what's going to happen, or ambiguity. I don't know what to do. And so those are all different kinds of characteristics of stresses. And we can't expect that we know how to deal with all of them. And so we need the ability to go to others and ask, I don't know how to deal with this. Can you offer a different perspective? And that's often a very useful process. All right, and the last one is about the recruitment of resources. So when we don't have resources, does the organisation have structures which allows us to acquire more? So that might be more time, that might be more autonomy, that might be more staff, like flexible staffing. Can we acquire more resources as individuals? And so does anyone experience this in their organisation if they've asked for more resources, or there are mechanisms for doing that?
I think at the moment, all of the agencies in Victoria are under so much stress with resources that is probably a point of contention. Things are being cut left, right and centre.
Yes, and I think the university sector is similar in that regard. And it is a difficult, it's a challenge. It might be something that we could pull off, like social support, like you need a support person or you need a mentor. Those things are resources that, if you don't have them, are very useful, and often we can make do with some of the existing structures that we have. And at least I know from the university sector, enhanced mentoring is something that we are looking at, particularly old senior people like me mentoring younger people and providing that greater level of support based on their feedback and request for more of that kind of support. So that's just an example.
Somebody's put in there various types of leave as being a resource, but above that there was a question about, could you please tell us more about debriefing a micro-stressor?
Yeah, so based on our theory about how resilience develops over the life course, we think that micro stresses or daily stresses that are of moderate severity are almost like a training ground for resilient capability development. And so if you think about that capability development in a similar way, you think about learning math, or you don't start with calculus. Calculus is kind of similar as a trauma in this analogy, whereas daily stresses are like numeracy, like learning how to count. So you start on the lower levels of stuff like basic numeracy, addition, subtraction, and then you might move up to algebra. And so basically you start with moderate daily stresses and hassles. That's also important because if you're thinking about developing resilient capabilities, hopefully in most people's lives, trauma is fairly infrequent. So if you are relying on traumatic events to develop capability, then like just numerically and statistically improbable events are not a good way to do that. So that's why we focus on micro stresses. The structure of the debriefing process is then on things like what happened, like I described that I went through with my son. So what is your experience and what were you trying to achieve? And I got him to tell me about his thoughts and his feelings and what he did and what he wanted in that particular scenario. And then I asked him about, well, what could you learn from this? And the learning part is really important because it almost forces a re-evaluation of the event as threatening and negative to something that can be used as a growth opportunity. And that in the psychological world is called challenge appraisal, where if we can learn and grow from something, it's far more stressful, and we see it as less stressful and less difficult, but it's also presenting itself as an opportunity. And so we flip that around. And then I asked him to evaluate, what he did in the circumstance to cope. And he said to me, I took some deep breaths. And I said, well, how well did this work? Oh, not well. It didn't work well at all. I was terrified. And he had all of these, difficulties. And I said, okay, well, that's fine. So what worked for you? He said nothing worked. And that's something that's common too. Like people saying, look, nothing worked for me. The reason I ask about what worked is we want to maintain the good stuff. So we're not only interested in gaps, but we're also interested in what strengths people have. And in the army, people say, oh, I'm really funny. I'm good at making humour out of difficult situations, which is very common in army. And they will often cheer others up and themselves by using humour. So they'll highlight that as a strength. And then what would you do the next time? And so the next time he said, well, I'm going to try to describe my environment in my head. And I'm going to say, the stage is brown. I can hear children and, speaking. And this is a grounding strategy, which he has come up with independently. And that's important because when I'm telling people how to cope, it may not be useful to them. It's not theirs. And so it's not about telling, it's about a self-generative, self-discovery process. Now, when he does this next, he may find that it doesn't work, and that's fine. But the point is to continue to go through the cycle of reflection and refinement so that you can actually grow those capabilities over time. It is not a one-shot strategy, and it's not linear. It's a little bit like learning to lead. You make mistakes in leadership as you grow and you learn, but you reflect on those mistakes and you try to develop your capabilities as a leader. It is not linear. And so that's kind of the process in a nutshell. We work through what happened, how well did it work, so evaluative, and then what would you do next time that you had to experience this? And I said to him, would you do this again? And he said, absolutely. And that's great. That's really important for me because it's not about the outcome of this situation. It's about re-engaging and keep continual learning to develop that resilient human. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that sounds really good. I'm just really conscious of the time, Monique. Was there anything else that you wanted to finish up with?
No, just to say that I'll move to my next slide, which is here. If you have more questions or you want to understand or you even want to license some of these packages that we have around reflection and the resilient capacity development, you can contact me. If you just want to stay in touch with our centre and what we're doing in the centre, we actually have a resilience symposium coming up on the 5th of February 2026. So we're preparing for that now. And it'll be half a day. If you're interested in coming along to that, connect with us at LinkedIn and you'll see posts very shortly about that event. So I just wanted to highlight that you can reach out about learning more and even purchasing or licensing products from us.
So, Monique, you asked at the start about the model and what we thought of the model. I mean, the model makes perfect sense to me. It's when you think about old school resilience training and what this is saying is that there's so many other elements to it that need to be brought into it to make it a holistic approach. I mean, that makes absolute sense to me. So I'm sure others agree as well. So look, there's no more questions in the chat. It's right on the dot of 4 o'clock. I know people have other meetings to go to. So I'm going to say thank you very much, Monique. That was fabulous. Really enjoyed that personally, and I'm sure others did as well. So there's some people clapping up there on the screen. I can see.
I can't see anything yet.
Well, I can assure you they're clapping. So thank you very much, and thanks everybody. We've got another webinar coming up on the 9th of December, and that's about the impact on families of operational deployments. And that's our students from America who are working with us at the moment. So we will send invites out to people for that. So look out for that one. That'll be interesting as well. So thank you all very much for attending, and we'll hope to see you next time. Bye.
Thanks for having me. Bye.